Hey y'all, thanks for joining me on the Panda channel. We're going to talk about this little gem here. August 24th of 95, Sierra Online and Roberta Williams created a point-and-click adventure game known as Phantasmagoria. This is a very unique and interesting game that was released in the industry around that time, since it was one of the first few point-and-clicks that were basically for the mature audience for Windows 3.1, 95, and even Mac. Interestingly enough, this classic title was also released in Japan exclusively for the Sega Saturn, and it wasn't called Phantasmagoria, it was actually called Phantasm. And I got the pleasure and enjoyment to actually play through this game and just enjoy the nostalgic qualities that it shares, and one of the most pivotal games in gaming history from Sierra Online, as it's just amazing in a lot of technical fronts at the time, and also all of the development work that kind of came with it. So, but before we do dive into that, let's first talk about the plot, gameplay, and then we'll even do kind of a little unboxing with this, and then my personal thoughts on the game as well. So the plot introduces a married couple named Adrian and Don, who have purchased an estate in the New England Islands. And Adrian is a successful mystery novelist, while Don is I guess somewhat successful, probably amateur photographer. They don't really kind of go into too details. But initially, the game itself introduces them to this estate, which has a fantastic deal and purchase, which most of these horror type games kind of come included with. But they find out, obviously, this estate was owned by a former magician who liked to conduct his Phantasmagoria acts, or kind of circus type activities, which in Europe, which is hence the name Phantasmagoria. But as the story moves on, Adrian explores the estate and finds a magic book secluded in some areas of the house, usually in the lower areas, and then unleashes a demon, which then comes onto Don, who then becomes possessed. And as you know, when it comes to possession and this sort of stuff in these horror stories, days move on, Don becomes worse and worse to Adrian and the world, and ending up causing a number of mysterious accidents or deaths. As this happened, Adrian soon discovers the history of Zoltan, who was the previous owner of the estate, who had pretty much over 5+ marriages to different women who mysteriously disappeared throughout his lifetime. Later, he'd be known to be murdered by Zoltan in the most graphic and intense ways, one being killed by actually potting dirt and basically being shoved into a potting jar, and then actually being kind of buried as far as the remains. One gets killed by a swing, blade. Another one is a medieval torture chamber, and then another one's even like a wine bottle to the face. So it's pretty graphic and grotesque and pretty intense of what happens to all of these different wives that you end up finding out as Adrian. As the game moves on, Don actually performs the most heinous of killings himself, which eventually leads to yours and Adrian's cunning wits, basically, to stop Don and exorcising the demon to survive the terror that is Phantasmagoria. With the cost of her loved ones and all of her friends in the lonely estate nearby in a small town, you can end up getting pretty crazy, grotesque, and awful ending into the game, or you can actually pick the good ending that kind of comes with a horror, where all she is left alone is with the estate herself in that small town, and kind of her mental toll that she has taken on in surviving and being able to be inquisitive enough, exorcise the demon, kill the demon, ends up killing Don, and Don, of course, ends up killing all the friends and everyone that you encounter, except for some of the folks, townspeople, that probably will end up writing more stories about what happened with poor little Adrian. So the gameplay for this is actually quite simple, but it does have some subtle layers of complexity to it with point-and-click games. So normally with point-and-click games, usually you have a number of actions that come included, where you select the action, you select the object, and then you have that interact with either another object or point of interest or something on the screen. But what's interesting with this is that it's actually quite simple. In most cases, you're either looking around in the room and you have the same type of cross cursor, and when it turns red, it tells you that there's some interactivity that you can perform by selecting it. But generally, it was kind of innovative. You can actually select your objects that you run into and actually combine said objects with those areas of activity in order to get that interaction to happen. So for instance, you want to open a wine cellar. You select it first to basically uncover it if there's a carpet on top, and the cursor itself will glow red. You'll move it, and then when you attempt to open it, obviously it'll tell you if there's a problem. And then you can use either the crowbar or one other item that you pick up in order to actually interact with that piece with it. So at the time, it was a pretty complex system, but it's simplistic in the sense. What also is interesting, they have a complex system of inspection. So you can inspect every item with the eyeball and taking the item and actually looking at it and interacting with it. Unfortunately, it's only with a few items that this happens, usually with like the letter opener or a few other things in the game. But it is one of the first that I've ever seen, especially in a 95 game. So it's pretty incredible when it comes to the gameplay of it. Filmed similarly, full motion video capture, and it's kind of similar to Night Trap, Sewer Shark, more of other ones around the time. And the first 6 chapters of gameplay are just fantastic point-and-click adventure as you're trying to identify, explore the estate, explore all the different parts of town. And what's interesting is the first 6 chapters of gameplay, you're basically teaching yourself and learning the different ways, secret places, areas of interest when it comes to Phantasmagoria, especially that estate. Find out as you explore and open things up, there's secret doors, passages, and ways in order to get around the house. And this in itself, even though it is relevant to the story as there's different parts of it, it actually teaches you to learn and understand the estate, because in chapter 7, that's when things kind of take a turn, where the first several chapters, like I said, gives you that necessary information to complete the game and use those skills and knowledge. And then chapter 7, it turns the knob up for you needing to actually not only try to solve and exercise and complete the mystery of Phantasmagoria, but you're also in a chase where literally you're using the knowledge and information that you got from the first 6 chapters of hiding around the house, traveling, and go around to the different places to hide from Don, who is at this point fully possessed, just crazy, looking to actually perform heinous and terrible crimes like Zoltan did before. And you have to actually run, hide, and in some cases defend yourself with the certain object set. Ultimately, that ends up leading to the ultimate showdown at the end as you evade Dawn, and then of course the demon makes an appearance as you're exorcising it. So, let's go ahead and unbox this puppy and we can kind of see what's in here. So obviously with Phantasmagoria, it's got that excellent detail of a dead body, pretty much with spoils of blood and FMVs on the back. And as we open up the box itself, we've got the nice big box opening with the, cardboard area. Now, what's interesting is that when I was 10, and this is how I knew about this game, I knew about it for a while mainly because of the fact that this CD case was actually in the case with all the games that I had for my PC that my dad actually purchased. And when he had this, it just showed this with the passage on the back. I knew nothing about this game. I didn't even know it was something that existed. I didn't even know mature rated games at the time were out and about, but they were, and I remember trying to install this and actually play it. And unfortunately for my Gateway desktop, we could not actually play it. So finally, in the time of now, I was able to actually play it from start to end in full completion. So 8 discs, same thing for the Phantasm Sega Saturn version, all for that. This has, Recommendations. Obviously, it says use Microsoft Windows. It's got some handy know stuff, and then how to actually perform this stuff with DOS, with CD Sierra and Phantasmagoria. It's got the manual that comes included, which has everything here that shows you kind of the FMV and everything that comes included. And yeah, it's pretty good, pretty thick book there. We got Casino Land access request and some helpful tips and information on other stuff that is in relation to games that are being offered from Imagination, as you can see. And then we've got Crash Proof, your PC for free. PC 911 provides relief with disaster strikes. So actually more kind of advertisement pieces, free color clip art, Revolution, free CD for great restaurants and wineries and breweries. So definitely pure 90s joy that you're seeing in here. So with that, we'll go ahead and put these back in here. I'm so glad that I actually have this. And again, this big box has included with everything that's with one of these games, including all of the Windows 3.1, Windows 95 DOS CDs that are inside at the bottom right with a pure Sierra game. This is also coming included with other areas that were also provided, like other games and other Sierra products of the actual demo disc in Chapter 1. Interestingly enough, the gameplay is completely the same. There's only a few minor differences that I've noticed between this, and that is the music is actually some placeholders that are in there that are not as final as it would be in here. And then last but not least, we have the strategy guide, which actually has a lot of helpful information. It even has images of all of the old, the text and the letters and things that are in the game, so you can actually read it. And then it also gives you clues on everything going from start to finish, as well as everybody that is infamously know about Sierra games, different areas, points of interest, so that you can kind of catch up on. Not only that, though, and this is what's interesting, and we can talk about it here in just a minute, but there's even some parts of this where it talks about the development of the game, with interviews with also all of the actors and actresses as well that comes included with this. So pretty fantastic buy, $7 on Amazon, and I was able to find it. So with that being said, the development of this game was incredible. To give you some backstory, so Roberta Williams, who was working with Ken Williams at Sierra Online, worked on designing a number of titles, usually in the King's Quest kind of series with Sierra, but she would later to go on to actually work on and develop on Mystery House and the Laura Bow series as her murder and crime stories in the 1990s. And based on some of the reports I read, Roberta wanted to make a horror game for about 8 years prior to the release of Phantasmagoria. And in November 1995, obviously that's what we're looking at, August and up to November for this game to be released. It was originally set to have a budget for like close to $800,000, which was the main focus of Sierra at the time, as they wanted low-cost budget games focused on combat. Concerns of the adult nature and controversial scenes of content of the game was also pretty immense, and something that is of a lot of discussion and concern during the development of it. But development continued with it, and it actually ended up being huge. It went from, to 200 people, 25 actors, contractual advisors actually from the film industry to make sure that they got the nice FMV kind of scenes that you're seeing in the game itself. And the budget ended up blowing up from $800,000 to about $4.5 million, at least based on some of these reports. There was a number of delays, but it was advertised in the game industry, and Sierra is very forthcoming when it came to, as well as Roberta and others that were working on the project, that they were very forthcoming on the fact that this is a very mature rated game, hence the mature rated kind of rating on the front. And as it, kind of it caused a little bit of concern, mainly because the mature rated, and there wasn't a lot of games at the time, at least, that was released with that. And so it exhibited in the game itself a number of things like blood, gore, and some of the graphic murder nature of the murders that happened in there. There is an implied scene of forced activity with the special R word I can't say. I will say this, after watching and playing through the games, it's kind of implied. There's obviously nothing that incorporates that, but it was kind of one of those things that at the time for 95 definitely probably pushed it across the threshold to the point where literally it was released everywhere when it did come out, but companies like CompUSA wasn't going to actually pass for it. They didn't actually come out and say that they weren't going to release it because of that controversial scene, but they did say that for some titles they'll release some and be part of it, and others they won't. So it was interesting. In Australia, of course, due to the controversial nature of the game, basically said they weren't going to actually release the game itself. So, but yeah, like I said, the scene isn't explicit enough to actually show it. It just kind of implies it. It's not something that's super mentioned, other than the fact that, when it was talked about, especially in the book itself, and mentioned based on reports to Roberta, she mentioned that it kind of had to get that intense, and it does make sense for the story because it kind of puts the point of no return when it comes to Adrian needing to make a decision of whether or not she's going to stick with Don or if she's going to leave him. And obviously there's a choice that's being exhibited in the game itself. The interesting thing is that there is a censor. Like with the game itself, you do start and it is uncensored, but you can actually add a censor filter that will filter out all the adult, mature rated scenes of blood and gore. There is some sexual activity, but it's very minimal. It doesn't actually really show much that I've seen, but it does kind of blur that out, and the way it works is very interesting. So when you get into the game, you select that you want to censor the game, and then it asks you to input a password and tells you have to remember the password. If you do not remember the password, you have to uninstall and reinstall the game in order for it to work. So, very interesting way of doing it. It is a very interesting kind of measure to prevent that. But yeah, as much as it had all of that going against it and whatnot, as far as the controversial nature of the game and it being mature rated only, just like, in the industry, when you're releasing something for rated R for movies, you're going to get only a certain cut of those audience members. But despite all that, when it was released, more than 300,000 copies was actually released in the first week in August 95. And it made well more than the actual budget that it cost to create it, which would gross more than $12 million in its first week at the time, which is interesting for a mature rated game, especially FMV like this. And it does become one of the best-selling games for Sierra Online to date, with a massive success despite all the challenges and growths that came with it. And, the technology they highlight in here is interesting. All of the actors and actresses and everybody is performing in front of a blue screen. And a lot of times, you usually get, if you play a lot of these point-and-click games, especially with FMVs, you'll have a certain amount of backdrops or just background images that are being used. And usually it's within maybe less than 100, maybe a few hundred. This ended up taking more than 1,000, and it does make sense when you start playing the game because there are just tons of locations, places to go, and it feels pretty incredible, especially a game from 95. And it's an interesting game to play and to experience in history when it comes to big box classic retro PC games. So my personal thoughts and feelings on the game is that it's just an incredible. I actually very much enjoyed it, and I'll be honest, I had my reservations in the beginning because sometimes these games don't age well. They don't age well at all, typically. And this one did. I mean, at the time when it comes to the scripting and the story, obviously around the 90s when it came for that, it was always start out happy, something happens, horrific. And the horror aspect of it goes in a very extreme way, which actually works out really well for the game. And I was just kind of shocked by it, by how extreme they went. But it makes a lot of sense. It makes you feel very much part of the process and part of the estate, and kind of that longing to learn more. Adrian and Don's relationship is very valid, and it shows up really well. They do work really, really well together. And actually, it's funny because there's a point in here that talks about the interview process with the actress that plays Adrian and also the actor that plays Don. And they did ask a question to Adrian saying, like, is there a real life romance between you two? Isn't the two that play the married couple, Adrian and Don, which he indicates, yes, they are dating at the time. Looking at IMDb and a lot of other things too, they're actually, I believe, still married and together, because they got married shortly after and have a relationship still ongoing, which is pretty crazy and incredible and awesome to hear. So anyway, back to my personal thoughts. I was very much more impressed with the technology, how the FMV works, and the scripting and story definitely encapsulated me, where I wanted to have the replayability to go back and learn more, because you can go through the game at certain points and just stick to the main storyline and not actually find out what happens to some of the folks that have vagrancy that actually live in the house. And you eventually find out the vagrants that actually live in the place that you're at, that how their demise happens, what happens to them, how Don does it. And there's different points of interest, like the Synthahol. There's a fortune teller that tells you lessons and different things on every day that you actually go through the whole story. And it's a pretty incredible experience to learn about all that. You can also go to town and talk with folks and see their kind of evolution from start to finish. And every day it's a little bit different. So it's pretty incredible as far as the game goes. I very much enjoyed this to the point that it's probably going to be part of my Halloween or horror lineup, just because of the fact that FMV and the story gets so intense, but it's also encapsulating at the same time. It definitely brings a huge level of nostalgia, and definitely that retro PC gaming history that you kind of wish was still in some of the newer games nowadays, where the focus was a bit smaller and focused on bringing you a great, incredible tale and story. And this is a really good one when it comes to horror, demonic possession, aggression, and seeing also just the horror that comes with mad, crazy type of magicians in order to perform acts to become popular, and for his actual search for learning what true power is when it comes to the world of Phantasmagoria. So highly recommend it if you get a chance. You can get it on Steam. Pretty good price, actually. It uses DOSBox and works really well in all of my experiences with the gameplay that's captured. So anyway, that's Phantasmagoria. Feel free to look at the clips and everything, and as far as the gameplay of some of the streams that I've done. And I've also done some shorts too, because I'm sure you've seen it. So it's a pretty incredible game. So with that being said, have a good one. And hopefully we'll see you in the Zoltan estate, learning about the ways of Phantasmagoria of Windows 95.